So because I've been tackling the controversial subjects lately, I just felt I'm on a roll. Why not continue? So today I want to talk about why we as Protestants should not fight the claim that the Roman bishop, or the Pope, actually does have authority. Okay, I said it. Now, the reason I don't think we should fight that is by acknowledging the authority and the role of the Pope, acknowledging that he is the patriarch of the West, if we will, is not the same thing as saying that we accept his authority over the entirety of the church, and especially not his authority to be infallible in certain scenarios. So I think that we as Protestants are so resistant to this idea. We're so resistant to the idea that the church, the Pope of Rome, has any sort of authority or precedent that has been known throughout church history. And I think it really does damage to our ability to articulate history, because I'll tell you, I was having a conversation with some Catholics, and I just straight up asked them, I said, there's a lot of things about Catholicism I just can't get behind the idea of the Pope. And they kind of started to press me as to why, and I basically said, well, because the Pope, there was no acknowledgement that he had any sort of primacy or any sort of special authority or role anywhere in the early church. That's a new development. And much to my surprise, they showed me a bunch of different writings from a bunch of different church fathers who all acknowledged the Bishop of Rome has an apostolic authority that was given to him. Now, again, it's very possible for us as Protestants to acknowledge this, to honor that reality, while still denying the papal infallibility and the universality of his jurisdiction. We don't have to acknowledge that, and I do believe that there are elements in history that show that's just not the way things were. I believe the Pope of Rome had a first among equals type attitude at first. But then I believe nearing the time of the Great Schism, one of the big problems that arose was that there was a claim that the Pope now had more authority than that. Authority to override even other bishops in the church. There was no corporate decision that they would all come together in equality with one another. There was an understanding that the Pope was above now in his role, Vicar of Christ. And then, of course, in the more recent time, you have papal infallibility that was developed. Now, these are modern things, but that doesn't change history in the way the early church saw the Bishop of Rome. And so I think that we as Protestants, if we're going to be intellectually and historically honest, we need to acknowledge that in the early church, there was an understanding that the Bishop of Rome had a specific role ordained and given by God. And First Clement, in his letter to the Corinthians, he's speaking to them as though he has a specific type of authority. And he was considered to be one of the first popes. And as we continue on, there are other church writings. And the one I wanted to read that I thought was the most remarkable was Saint Irenaeus of Lyons. He's considered to be by many one of the most prolific church fathers. He has a lot of writings on a lot of different subjects, and a lot of people really go to him to get a lot of details about certain things, and also argue about the dating of the book of Revelation. That's Irenaeus. But anyways, listen to this quote. This is from Against Heresies, written around 189 AD. He says, "Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vanity, by blindness, or perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings by indicating a tradition derived from the apostles of the very, very great and very ancient and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church agree with this church, on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, insofar as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those faithful men who exist everywhere. Now, the reason I like this quote, there are two reasons. The first one is he acknowledges that every church everywhere should be in communion with Rome. I mean, it's pretty explicit that that's what he states. Now, I like that because I have an ecumenical heart, and my ecumenical heart desires communion with Rome. I would love for all churches, all Protestants, to come back into communion with Rome. I really would. And I think that every Protestant, if you are truly honest that you want unity and you want oneness, we should all desire the day when the Orthodox and the Protestants all come together with Rome once again in unity with one another. So I don't think what he's proposing here, us Protestants should try to sneak around and try to avoid. But what I really like that he says, it is a matter of necessity that every church agree with this church, speaking of Rome, on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere. Listen to this. Insofar as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those faithful men who exist everywhere. So in other words, the way I understand this at least, is that this church should be honored, esteemed above all, so far as the apostolic tradition is preserved. And so I think that we as Christians, we as Protestant Christians, can look and see that there was a time, specifically during the medieval time, that tradition was not quite preserved well. The apostolic tradition was lost in the minutiae of the ever-changing scholastics at the time. And the problem with this is that we can no longer look at Rome as being true and faithful to the fullest extent of the word. And so I think that we as Protestants, I'm kind of rambling here, but I just want to make the point that it's intellectually dishonest to not acknowledge the role of the Bishop of Rome, the role that was understood by the early church. I've read a lot of these church fathers. There was an understanding for sure. It's dishonest for us to try to discard that and try to dance around it when we can acknowledge it without having to acknowledge all the things that we sometimes assume come with it. I don't acknowledge the infallibility of the Pope. I don't acknowledge that he has universal jurisdiction over everyone other than a first among equals, which is not accepted. And so because of that, there are reasons that I'm not in communion with Rome. However, we should be praying for restoration in that way, that we come into union with Rome again, that we come into union with the Catholic Church, and that through that unity will be reached. And we don't do that when we try to dance around history. We do that when we acknowledge history and then we try to take steps to do that. Not at the cost of truth, not at the cost of good, sound doctrine, but in the pursuit of unity, our hope should be to unify with the Catholic Church, not to find reasons to disunify and to run the other way. So that's my little spiel for the day. Study out the church fathers. If you're not convinced that Rome had a specific role in the early church, look it up, read it yourself, be honest with your findings, and go from there.